Frank Lucas was in Harlem when a rival drug lord said, "You're too small to run this game." 10 seconds later, the country boy who refused to be small, Frank Lucas, was born in La Grange, North Carolina, in 1930, a place far removed from the concrete canyons of Harlem. His early life was steeped in the harsh realities of the Jim Crow South, a world where racial injustice was not just a concept, but a daily, brutal fact. It was here, in the dusty fields and segregated towns, that the seeds of his future ruthlessness were sown. The most formative, and perhaps most traumatic, event of his childhood occurred when he was just 6 years old. He witnessed his cousin, a young black man, murdered by the Ku Klux Klan for the unforgivable crime of looking at a white woman. The image of his cousin's lifeless body, dragged behind a truck, burned itself into Frank's memory, a searing testament to the powerlessness and indignity inflicted upon his people. This horrific experience instilled in him a deep-seated distrust of authority and a fierce determination to never again be a victim. He vowed that no one would ever control him, and he would never be small enough to be dismissed. By the time he was a teenager, Frank had already developed a reputation for being quick-witted and unafraid. He engaged in petty crimes, hustling, and surviving in a world that offered few legitimate opportunities for a young black man. The South, with its rigid social structures and inherent dangers, felt like a cage. He yearned for something more, a place where a man could make his own rules, or at least bend them to his will. That place, he believed, was Harlem. In the mid-1940s, like countless other African Americans seeking escape from the South's oppressive grip, Frank made the journey north, arriving in New York City with little more than the clothes on his back and a burning ambition in his heart. Harlem in the 1940s and 50s was a vibrant, bustling metropolis, a cultural mecca, but also a crucible of crime and opportunity. Frank quickly learned the ropes, navigating the complex social hierarchies and the intricate underworld that thrived beneath the surface. He started small, running numbers, engaging in street fights, and doing whatever it took to carve out a niche for himself. He was a keen observer, always listening, always learning. He understood that power in Harlem wasn't just about brute force. It was about intelligence, connections, and an unwavering resolve. His big break, or at least the beginning of his true education, came when he met Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was a legend, the undisputed godfather of Harlem, a man of intellect, charm, and brutal efficiency. He was a numbers runner, a racketeer, and a community figure all rolled into one. Frank, with his quiet intensity and sharp mind, caught Bumpy's eye. He started as Bumpy's driver, a seemingly innocuous role that placed him at the very heart of Harlem's criminal empire. For years, Frank was Bumpy's shadow, his confidant, his protege. He drove Bumpy to meetings with Italian mob bosses, to clandestine poker games, to negotiations with rival gangs. He listened intently as Bumpy dispensed wisdom, settled disputes, and orchestrated his vast network of illicit enterprises. From Bumpy, Frank learned the intricacies of the drug trade, the numbers racket, and the delicate dance of power sharing with the Italian mafia. He saw how Bumpy commanded respect, not just through fear, but through a unique blend of charisma, strategic thinking, and a genuine, albeit complicated, commitment to his community. Bumpy taught him that a true boss didn't just take. He also gave back, maintaining a fragile peace and a semblance of order in a chaotic world. Frank absorbed every lesson, every nuance, filing it away for a future he knew would eventually arrive. He understood that Bumpy's era, while legendary, was slowly fading. The old ways were giving way to new, more brutal realities. Then, in 1968, Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack. His death left a gaping void in Harlem's underworld, a power vacuum that every ambitious hustler and established crime family immediately sought to fill. The Italian mafia, which had long tolerated Bumpy as a necessary evil and a shrewd negotiator, saw an opportunity to assert full control. Other Harlem drug lords, eager to stake their claim, began to emerge from the shadows. But Frank Lucas, the quiet driver, the man who had spent years in Bumpy's shadow, saw it differently. He didn't just see a void. He saw an opportunity to build something entirely new, something bigger and more efficient than anything Harlem had ever seen. He was determined to not just fill Bumpy's shoes, but to transcend them, to create an empire that would make Bumpy's look like a corner store. He would not be small. He would not be dismissed. Want to discover more untold stories of Harlem's most notorious figures? Subscribe now and never miss the truth behind the legends. The period immediately following Bumpy Johnson's death in 1968 was a tumultuous one for Harlem. The delicate balance of power Bumpy had maintained for decades shattered, plunging the drug trade into a chaotic free-for-all. The Italian mafia families, particularly the Genovese and Lucchese, saw an opening to tighten their grip on the lucrative Harlem market, which Bumpy had largely kept independent. They began muscling in, demanding a piece of every action, from numbers to narcotics. Local dealers, emboldened by the absence of the old guard, also began to carve out their own territories, leading to frequent, bloody skirmishes. It was a time of uncertainty, where alliances shifted like sand and violence was the primary currency of power. Amidst this maelstrom, Frank Lucas, Bumpy's former driver, was an anomaly. He wasn't flashy, he didn't boast, and he didn't immediately declare himself the new king. Instead, he moved with a quiet intensity, observing, planning, and slowly consolidating his own nascent network. Many dismissed him, seeing him as a relic of Bumpy's era, a man who lacked the charisma or the brute force to command respect in the new, more cutthroat landscape. They saw his relatively modest stature and his reserved demeanor as weaknesses, mistaking his silence for timidity. This underestimation culminated in the pivotal scene that would define Frank Lucas's early rise. The exact details vary in the retelling, but the essence remains consistent. A confrontation where his authority was openly challenged. It could have been a meeting in a smoky backroom, a casual encounter in a busy club, or a tense sit-down orchestrated by a mutual acquaintance. The rival, often depicted as a loud, arrogant figure, perhaps an Italian mafia representative trying to assert dominance, or another ambitious Harlem dealer like Nicky Barnes, saw Frank as an easy target. The air was thick with the smell of stale liquor and the unspoken threat of violence. The rival, a man whose physical presence dwarfed Frank's, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. He had been holding court, boasting of his connections, his muscle, his plans to control Harlem. Then, his gaze fell on Frank, who had been listening intently, his face unreadable. "Look at you, Lucas," the rival scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "You're too small to run this game. Harlem belongs to us now. Go back to driving cars, boy, before you get hurt." The words hung in the air, a challenge, an insult, a public humiliation. A hush fell over the room, every eye fixed on Frank. The other men present, a mix of street soldiers, aspiring kingpins, and wary observers, held their breath, anticipating Frank's reaction. Would he cower? Would he lash out in a fit of impotent rage? Or would he simply retreat, confirming their low opinion of him? 10 seconds later, the room exploded. Frank Lucas didn't raise his voice. He didn't even flinch. Instead, his eyes, which had been calm moments before, hardened into chips of ice. He reached slowly into his jacket, not with a sudden, aggressive movement, but with a deliberate, almost theatrical grace. The rival, still smirking, watched, perhaps expecting a small pistol, a token gesture of defiance. What Frank produced, however, was far more shocking. From his jacket, Frank pulled out a .45 caliber automatic pistol, not to point it, but to place it gently on the table before him. Then, with the same unhurried precision, he pulled out a second .45 and placed it beside the first. Finally, he reached into his other pocket and produced a small, gleaming .38 revolver, laying it carefully next to the other two. 3 firearms, all loaded, all within easy reach. He then looked directly into the rival's eyes, his voice a low, dangerous growl that cut through the silence like a razor. "I ain't too small for nothing, motherfucker," he said, his words barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a death sentence. "And this ain't a game. This is my life. And if you think you're gonna take it, you better bring an army." The rival's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned terror. The bravado drained from his face, leaving him pale and trembling. He had expected a fight, perhaps even a shootout, but not this cold, calculated display of readiness, this absolute lack of fear. Frank hadn't just threatened him. He had demonstrated an unwavering resolve, a willingness to die and take others with him that few possessed. He wasn't just a man with a gun. He was a man who had already made peace with violence, a man who understood that true power lay not in bluster, but in an unshakable will. The message was sent, loud and clear, throughout Harlem's underworld. Frank Lucas was not to be underestimated. He was not Bumpy Johnson, but he was something new, something perhaps even more dangerous. He was a man who would not be dismissed, a man who would not be told he was too small. From that moment on, the whispers about Bumpy's old driver changed. They spoke of his coldness, his fearlessness, and his quiet, terrifying resolve. The game had a new player, and he was ready to rewrite the rules. If you're enjoying this incredible true story, hit that like button. It helps us bring you more untold histories. The confrontation in the social club was more than just a display of force. It was a declaration of intent. Frank Lucas had established himself as a formidable presence, but he knew that respect, especially in the drug game, had to be earned and maintained through innovation and dominance. He understood that the traditional methods of drug trafficking, relying on Italian mafia middlemen who controlled the supply lines from the docks, were inefficient, expensive, and left too much room for corruption and interception. Frank had a different vision, a revolutionary idea that would cut out the middleman entirely and allow him to control the entire supply chain, from source to street. His genius idea was simple yet audacious. Go directly to the source of the purest heroin. While other dealers were buying diluted product from the mafia at inflated prices, Frank looked halfway across the world, to Southeast Asia, specifically the Golden Triangle, which was then a major hub for opium production. The Vietnam War was raging, and American soldiers were deeply entrenched in the region. This tragic conflict, Frank realized, presented an unprecedented opportunity. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Frank Lucas made several trips to Southeast Asia, forging direct connections with opium growers and refiners. He bypassed the traditional French connection routes and the Italian mob's stranglehold on New York's ports. His most infamous and highly disputed claim was the cadaver connection. Frank alleged that he smuggled heroin into the United States using the coffins of fallen American soldiers. He claimed he paid a skilled carpenter in North Carolina to build false bottoms into the caskets, allowing him to pack hundreds of pounds of pure heroin alongside the bodies of the deceased. While this claim has been widely sensationalized and largely debunked by law enforcement and military officials who state such a scheme would have been logistically impossible and morally reprehensible, it became a cornerstone of his legend, a testament to his perceived audacity and ruthlessness. Regardless of the exact method, what is undeniable is that Frank Lucas found a way to import massive quantities of unadulterated heroin directly into the United States. This direct supply chain allowed him to create Blue Magic, his signature brand of heroin. Unlike the heavily cut and diluted products sold by his rivals, Blue Magic was reportedly 98 to 100% pure. This purity was a game-changer. Frank could sell his product at a lower price than his competitors, yet still make a far greater profit because he wasn't paying middlemen. A kilo of heroin that cost him a few $1,000s in Asia could be sold for hundreds of thousands, even millions, on the streets of Harlem. The purity also meant that users got a much more potent high, quickly making Blue Magic the most sought-after drug in the city. Addicts flocked to his network, abandoning other dealers whose product couldn't compare. Frank built his empire with military precision. He employed family members from North Carolina, believing they were less likely to betray him than street-hardened New Yorkers. His cousins, brothers, and nephews formed a loyal, disciplined crew, operating with a level of trust and efficiency rarely seen in the chaotic drug trade. He established a sophisticated distribution network, controlling every aspect from importation to street-level sales. His organization was lean, ruthless, and incredibly effective. As his wealth grew, so did his lifestyle. Frank Lucas became incredibly rich, accumulating a fleet of luxury cars, multiple properties, and a lavish wardrobe. He owned apartment buildings, businesses, and even a ranch in North Carolina. Yet, he often maintained a relatively low profile, preferring to blend in rather than flaunt his wealth, a lesson perhaps learned from Bumpy. However, there were moments when his ego, or perhaps a desire to prove his success, got the better of him. The most famous instance was at the fight of the century between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier in Madison Square Garden in 1971. While other mob bosses and celebrities were dressed in understated suits, Frank Lucas arrived wearing a magnificent, full-length chinchilla coat and matching hat, reportedly worth $100,000. He sat ringside, a conspicuous figure of opulence, a stark contrast to his usual low-key persona. This display of wealth, while a moment of triumph for him, also drew unwanted attention, a subtle crack in his carefully constructed facade of anonymity. It was a fleeting moment of glory, a public declaration that this small man from North Carolina had indeed conquered the game. What do you think about Frank's strategy? Was he a criminal genius or just ruthless? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. At its peak, Frank Lucas's empire was a formidable force, controlling the vast majority of Harlem's heroin trade. He was, by many accounts, earning $1 million a day, a staggering sum that allowed him to live a life of unimaginable luxury while simultaneously funding a vast network of street dealers and enforcers. His organization, built on the foundation of family loyalty, was incredibly efficient. His relatives, brought up from North Carolina, were entrusted with key roles, ensuring a level of trust and discretion that was rare in the cutthroat world of drug trafficking. They operated out of various safe houses and stash pads across Harlem, moving product with a quiet professionalism that made them difficult to detect. However, such immense power and wealth inevitably attract attention, both from rival criminals and, more dangerously, from law enforcement. Frank's chinchilla coat at the Ali Frazier fight was just one of many instances where his growing visibility began to chip away at his carefully cultivated anonymity. The sheer volume of blue magic flooding the streets and the devastating impact it had on the community made it impossible for authorities to ignore. Enter Detective Richie Roberts, a tenacious and incorruptible narcotics officer from Newark, New Jersey. Roberts was an outsider, a man who refused to be bought or intimidated, a rarity in an era when police corruption was rampant. He began to notice the unusual purity of the heroin on the streets and the sudden shift in the drug market's dynamics. Unlike other officers who focused on street-level busts, Roberts had a keen eye for the bigger picture, sensing a sophisticated operation behind the new, potent supply. He assembled a dedicated task force, a small group of honest cops determined to dismantle the drug networks plaguing their communities. Roberts and his team began to meticulously track the flow of money and drugs, slowly piecing together the puzzle that would eventually lead them to Frank Lucas. The investigation was long and arduous, fraught with danger and frustration. Lucas, with his network of informants and his careful operational security, was difficult to pin down. But Roberts was relentless. He followed leads, cultivated his own informants, and slowly built a case brick by painstaking brick. The pressure mounted on Lucas as law enforcement tightened its net. The lavish lifestyle, once a symbol of his success, now became a liability, making him a more visible target. The inevitable finally occurred on January 28, 1975. A massive raid, orchestrated by Richie Roberts and federal agents, swept through Lucas's various properties in New York and New Jersey. Frank Lucas was arrested in his New Jersey home, reportedly with over $500,000 in cash hidden in his attic. His empire, built on ambition, ruthlessness, and an innovative supply chain, crumbled around him. Facing a mountain of evidence and the prospect of a life sentence, Frank Lucas made a controversial decision that would forever alter his legacy. He chose to cooperate with the authorities. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he agreed to become an informant, providing extensive testimony against his former associates, including members of the Italian mafia and, most controversially, against corrupt police officers. His testimony led to the indictment and conviction of numerous drug dealers and, significantly, over 50 members of the New York Police Department's Special Investigations Unit, exposing a deep vein of corruption that shocked the city. This decision, while pragmatic for his own survival, earned him the scorn of many in the criminal underworld, who viewed him as a rat. He was sentenced to 70 years in prison, a term later reduced to 15 years due to his cooperation. His time in prison was marked by constant threats and the need for protective custody, a stark contrast to the untouchable kingpin he had once been. The man who had once commanded respect through fear and ingenuity now relied on the very system he had defied for his protection. There's so much more to this story. Subscribe to get notified about our upcoming deep dives into the war on drugs and the men who fought it on both sides. After serving approximately 15 years, Frank Lucas was released from prison in 1991. The Harlem he returned to was vastly different from the one he had left. The drug landscape had shifted, new players had emerged, and the era of the individual kingpin was largely over, replaced by more decentralized and violent street gangs. Lucas, now an older man, attempted to live a legitimate life, but the shadow of his past was long and inescapable. He struggled to find stable employment and often found himself in legal trouble, including a 2004 arrest for selling heroin again, for which he served another short stint in prison. His legend, however, found a new life in the early 2000s. His story caught the attention of Hollywood, culminating in the 2007 blockbuster film American Gangster, directed by Ridley Scott, and starring Denzel Washington as Frank Lucas and Russell Crowe as Richie Roberts. The film brought Frank Lucas's name to a global audience, cementing his place in popular culture as a cunning, ruthless, and iconic figure of the drug trade. However, the film, like many Hollywood adaptations, took significant liberties with the truth. It sensationalized certain aspects, conflated timelines, and exaggerated events for dramatic effect. The most prominent controversy surrounding his legend and the film was the cadaver connection. While Lucas vehemently maintained the story of smuggling heroin in coffins, law enforcement officials, military personnel, and even Richie Roberts himself have largely dismissed it as a fabrication, a colorful tale designed to enhance his mystique. Roberts, while acknowledging Lucas's brilliance as a criminal, stated that the coffin story was a total lie. This debate highlights the challenge of separating fact from fiction in the narratives of figures like Lucas, whose lives are often shrouded in myth and self-aggrandizement. Frank Lucas died on May 30, 2019, at the age of 88, in Cedar Grove, New Jersey. His passing marked the end of an era, a final chapter for a man who had defied expectations and carved out an empire from nothing. His impact on Harlem and the history of the drug trade is undeniable. He revolutionized drug trafficking by cutting out the middlemen, demonstrating a level of entrepreneurial cunning that was both destructive and, in a twisted sense, innovative. He showed that a black man from the rural South could rise to the pinnacle of organized crime, challenging the established order of the Italian mafia and proving that intelligence and ruthlessness knew no racial or social boundaries. His legacy remains complex and deeply divisive. To some, he was a criminal genius, a self-made man who beat the system and provided for his family, a modern-day Robin Hood who, despite his illicit activities, was seen as a protector in certain segments of the Harlem community. To others, he was a destructive force, a purveyor of poison who ravaged his own community, contributing to the addiction, violence, and despair that plagued Harlem for decades. The blue magic he introduced brought immense wealth to him and his associates, but it brought untold suffering to countless individuals and families. The irony of his life is profound. The small man from North Carolina, dismissed and underestimated, built one of the biggest drug empires in American history. He proved his detractors wrong, not just in that smoky backroom in Harlem, but throughout his entire criminal career. His life serves as a stark lesson. Never underestimate someone based on appearance, background, or perceived stature. Frank Lucas, for all his flaws and the devastation he wrought, was a testament to ambition, resilience, and a chillingly effective will to power. He was a man who refused to be small, and in doing so, left an indelible, albeit controversial, mark on history. If this story amazed you, show your support. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more incredible true stories that Hollywood can't even imagine. What other untold stories do you want us to cover next?